They say in 1752, a midwife from Pennsylvania delivered 3 children who all took their first breath before their mother drew her last. The problem was, she'd been dead for 2 days. What follows is not myth, it is record. Burned, rewritten, denied, yet the ink keeps surfacing through the centuries. You are not supposed to know this. What the colonies called birth defects, the church called duplications of the soul. And from 1750 to 1805, there were over 46 such cases, triplets, twins, and reflected children, whose existence tore through the natural order like a whisper that refused to die. The archives of Chester County speak of them in riddles. Parish journals stamped with black wax, entries removed, margins scraped clean. But if you lift the page toward firelight, faint outlines appear. They were born without mirrors. They spoke each other's thoughts. One was always older, though seconds apart. Dr. Matthias Ellery, a physician of unshakable reason, recorded his first encounter in 1755. He'd been summoned to examine the surviving twin of a woman named Mercy Dolan. The other child had vanished from the cradle the night before. No footprints, no forced door. The remaining infant's reflection in water showed 2 faces, one smiling, one asleep. Ellery never published again. His home was found years later, sealed from within, doors bolted, every mirror shattered except one. That one faced the ceiling. But this is only one case among dozens. The Delaware triplets of 1761 were said to share one pulse across 3 bodies. When one fell ill, all 3 bled from the same wound. Their burial records conflict. One states they died within hours. Another insists one lived on for decades, writing letters signed with 3 initials. By the turn of the century, the colonial governments quietly erased all references to reflected births. Clergymen were ordered to rename them false issue. Physicians who studied them were branded anatomical heretics. The few who persisted claimed something older was returning, an ancestral pattern the New World soil could not contain. The records grow more meticulous and more disturbing when one traces the lineage of these unnatural births. In 1753, in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a widow named Eliza Morrow gave birth to twins who defied measurement. Though born within minutes of each other, their hands and feet were subtly mismatched, as though reality itself could not decide their forms. Parish records described them as creatures of equal age and unequal presence, and local midwives whispered that Eliza's womb had carried spirits alongside flesh. Most accounts, if they survived, were veiled in the polite language of grief. The children showed early signs of infirmity, one entry reads, but the margins tell a different story. Scribbled annotations mention a child speaking before their mother did, repeating words no one else had spoken, repeating prayers from unknown chapels, uttering names that did not belong to the family. By 1756, physicians began noticing a pattern. Children born in clusters, twins, triplets, or more, who could anticipate each other's pain. A letter from Dr. Ezekiel Cartwright, a man of reason and observation, survives only in fragments. It describes a boy who vanished from his crib one night, only to appear the following morning in a neighboring town, silently rocking in the corner of a stranger's parlor. Cartwright's note ends with a single chilling line.
They are not absent. They travel through some unseen order.
Families reacted with fear. Ministers urged secrecy. One diary from Bucks County, undated but contemporary, warns, "To speak of them is to invite visitation. Keep them cloistered. Do not invite the curious, for the eyes of the earth are awake."
Those who ignored this advice suffered mysterious illnesses, sudden deaths, or children who never slept and never aged.
By the late 1750s, local magistrates were pressured by clergy and physicians to document these events in private ledgers. They labeled them reflected offspring, a term now all but vanished from public records. Yet these ledgers, when unearthed centuries later, display a terrifying consistency. Triplets, twins, siblings born in impossible sequence, children who disappeared only to return with knowledge no one could explain, and one in every cluster who seemed to age differently, older or younger than natural law allowed. And always, in every surviving case, one certainty: the community remembers. Whispered warnings, strange deaths, barns left open at night, the unmistakable feeling that something watched while no eyes were seen. The question haunting every document is silent but pervasive. How many of these children were ever truly human? And how many were a living echo of something older, something America itself was not ready to hold? By 1760, reports of multiple births with strange anomalies had begun to reach colonial authorities. Governors and magistrates were not concerned with mere superstition. The letters speak plainly of children exceeding reason, and families undone by the unnatural sequence of births. In Newport and York counties, ministers began quietly recording testimony from midwives, fathers, and neighbors.
Children born in clusters, yet each seemed to carry fragments of the other's personalities, sometimes finishing sentences, sometimes displaying knowledge impossible for their age. One ledger, found decades later in a private archive in Philadelphia, lists a series of triplets from a rural township. The first child was described as pale, slow to cry, yet eerily observant, watching the family from across rooms with an intensity noted by the mother. The second child, born 36 hours later, reportedly mimicked the elder's gestures before they were learned. The third, arriving hours after the second, appeared almost spectral, silent, with eyes that followed every movement in a way no ordinary child could manage. The midwife, who had attended hundreds of births, annotated her record with trembling script. Something within the womb obeys a law I cannot name nor trust. Physicians who attempted examination were met with resistance from families, some claiming divine intervention, others whispering of curses. But the notes suggest a more precise terror. The children were often said to anticipate death or illness in neighbors before any outward sign appeared. A boy named Samuel, born in 1762, reportedly spoke of a farmer's accident 3 days before it occurred. Witnesses swore he spoke not from hearsay, but as though the event had already happened somewhere unseen. Town councils quietly gathered records in closed chambers, forming committees to determine the legal and moral implications. These meetings, scarcely documented, produced only one directive. All births of unusual multiples must be recorded in private ledgers, sealed and hidden from public view. Ministers carried keys, magistrates swore oaths, physicians kept silent. One document, dated 1765, reads simply, "The children are not to be spoken of. Their pattern exists beyond our understanding." And yet, in the whispers of the townsfolk, a different story persisted. Children were seen walking alone at night in patterns too precise to be random, wandering fields in synchronization as though following a rhythm beyond human perception. Families who questioned them were struck by sudden illness, inexplicable accidents, or an unnatural silence that would hang over their homes for days. It was becoming clear, these were not merely children. They were something else entirely, a living record of repetition, a reflection of forces the colonies could neither name nor restrain. By the close of the 1760s, the ledger entries show a chilling consistency. Triplets, twins, and clusters of siblings always appearing where the soil was richest, and the eyes of the village quietly watching from the shadows, as if the land itself acknowledged the unnatural arrivals.
By 1770, the pattern of disappearances began to emerge alongside these unnatural births. Ledger entries buried in parish archives detail children vanishing from cradles, only to reappear days later in distant barns, churchyards, or even neighboring towns. Always unharmed, always silent, as though guided by some unseen hand. The local ministers and magistrates took note, not with curiosity, but with dread. It became a matter of survival for communities. To speak of these children was to invite calamity. One case, in rural Lancaster, describes a family whose triplets vanished one cold December night. Witnesses reported seeing 3 small figures move in perfect formation across a frozen creek, stopping as if sensing eyes upon them. When the parents followed, the children were gone, leaving only 3 shallow impressions in the snow and a faint whisper of a lullaby none had ever sung. The ledger notes, "No doors opened, no windows broken. They walked as if the frost itself parted for them." Midwives were the first to document what they called the restless wombs. They formed secret circles, hidden in barns and attics, sharing observations that terrified them. Children born under these circumstances often displayed uncanny knowledge of herbs, poisons, and the unseen rhythms of life and death. One midwife, Annabeth Klein, recorded her horror at a child who predicted the miscarriage of another mother's twin 3 nights before it occurred with unerring accuracy. Klein's journal ends abruptly. "I fear we are witnessing the womb's own intelligence, and it will not forgive our interference." Physicians, once rational, began to record phenomena with increasing anxiety. Dr. Jeremiah Cole, in 1774, wrote of twins who aged at different rates. One child matured physically, while the other remained infantile, yet both shared memories and emotions. His notes describe the confusion of families, the breakdown of social norms, and the strain on the parish's moral and spiritual authority. Cole's surviving letters reveal a growing consensus. These children were not anomalies. They were deliberate manifestations, a force beyond comprehension, one that both obeyed and ignored natural law. By the late 1770s, colonial authorities attempted to intervene. Town councils instructed midwives to report all multiple births, parents to maintain isolation, and physicians to submit detailed medical accounts. These instructions appear in surviving ledgers as underlined, almost frantic annotations. Yet the children persisted. Records suggest that the more scrutiny applied, the more extraordinary their behavior became, vanishing without trace, appearing in visions to neighbors, moving in unnatural synchrony, speaking in languages unknown to their parents. And always, in every account, the same chilling refrain.
The land remembers, and the children answer. Villagers began to whisper that these were not merely births, but continuations, echoes of something older than settlement, a force older than God's providence, threaded into the very soil of the colonies, waiting for eyes brave, or foolish enough to see.
By 1780, the colonial administrations recognized a problem they could not name. The ledger entries reveal closed-door meetings between magistrates, clergy, and physicians, detailing the unnatural births and their consequences.
They spoke in euphemisms, cases of irregular multiples, children beyond comprehension, yet the subtext was clear. These were occurrences that threatened social order, morality, and, some feared, the very fabric of life itself.
In Bucks County, a minister named Thomas Elbridge wrote in secret that several triplets born in the preceding decade behaved as if connected to one mind, yet 3 bodies could not contain it.
He describes the eldest child of a cluster staring at a parishioner for hours, whispering his thoughts back to him before the man could articulate them. The phenomenon terrified the community, yet the minister felt powerless. To speak openly would invite accusations of heresy or madness. Records indicate that midwives and physicians began deliberate suppression of births. Children were often hidden from neighbors, kept in isolated quarters, sometimes even under the supervision of distant relatives. A physician's note from 1782 reads, "The twins are to be considered stillborn in public records, though one breathes in private." Families complied, afraid of fines, social ostracism, and worse. A creeping sense that speaking of these children invited a force that could reach through walls, doors, and even time itself. Communities began reporting strange psychological effects. Parents of the hidden multiples described long periods of anxiety, insomnia, and a sense of being watched.
Neighbors reported faint, echoing laughter in abandoned barns, shadows moving against candlelight, and glimpses of children in places they could not have entered.
One diary recounts a father discovering his triplets in the cellar, perfectly lined, staring silently at the wall for hours, not acknowledging him or the candle he held.
The church tried to intervene, offering prayers, blessings, and holy water. Yet their journals admit failure.
One clergyman wrote, "The children do not flee the sacred. They walk through it untouched, as if it were no more than fog."
By the mid-1780s, the authorities were no longer trying to correct or hide these births. They were attempting to erase them entirely. Records were burned, ledgers were lost, and references in parish documents were systematically crossed out. Yet the children persisted, growing in secrecy, and the communities that concealed them fell into patterns of silence and fear, generations of whispered warnings, locked doors, and eyes that never rested. Even decades later, surviving letters suggest that the land itself remembered. One entry from 1785 remarks, "They are born in the richest soil. The oldest trees bear witness. If the children vanish, the earth does not forget. Neither should we." The sense of watching, the sense of inevitability, had become embedded in families, communities, and the land itself, a record of a reality they could neither name nor escape. By 1786, the consequences of these hidden births began to manifest in ways both subtle and horrifying. Families who harbored triplets or twins in secrecy reported illnesses that had no medical explanation. Children, even those not directly born under these anomalies, fell ill with fevers that came in patterns, sometimes coinciding with the emotional states of the multiples. Dr. Samuel Loring, a physician in rural Delaware, documented a case in 1787. A child born in 1779, though outwardly healthy, experienced convulsions the night a sibling, hidden in another town, was crying in the middle of the night. Loring's journal notes the chilling line, "A pulse not contained within a single body, a sickness shared without proximity." Deaths followed as the pattern of unnatural births continued. Parish death registries indicate clusters of child mortality concentrated around families known to harbor multiples. One midwife's private diary describes a set of triplets in Lancaster County where 2 children perished, and the third grew with shadows of the dead, speaking words belonging to its siblings. The diary's final entry reads, "I have attended births for 40 years, yet I have never felt such dread within the chamber of life itself." Local folklore began intertwining with reality. Parents whispered of children walking in patterns across fields, leaving footprints that did not correspond with their age or weight. Neighbors observed siblings appearing in rooms they could not have entered, sometimes repeating phrases of deceased family members, sometimes issuing warnings of misfortune before it occurred. It was a language no one else could comprehend, yet everyone recognized the threat. By 1790, town councils began documenting these occurrences with a clinical precision that belied their terror. Committees of physicians and ministers attempted to systematize the phenomenon, record births, monitor anomalies, conceal the children from public view, and enforce silence through social pressure and legal penalties. Yet even these measures failed. Children continued to vanish, reappear, or display knowledge no mortal should possess, and families began to understand that these were not mere misfortunes. They were repetitions, echoes,
a continuity beyond human comprehension. One surviving account from 1792, kept in a magistrate's ledger, describes a boy who disappeared for 3 nights, only to return to his family with no recollection of where he had been. Yet he could name neighbors' private sins, secrets no one had spoken aloud. The magistrate's annotation reads, "A child, yet more than child, carrying knowledge not given by God or man. The community fears it." By the end of the decade, the phenomenon had grown beyond the capacity of simple concealment. Patterns were being traced not only across families, but across counties. The multiplicity of these births, their inexplicable knowledge, and their inescapable presence made the settlers realize a terrifying truth. These children were a force embedded in the land itself, ancient and unyielding, silently asserting their existence while the adults could only watch and whisper. By the early 1790s, colonial authorities realized these were not isolated events. Ledger entries, still preserved in fragments across private collections, reveal that governors and local councils quietly convened secret committees to investigate clusters of unusual births. Their language is cautious, clinical, yet betrays fear. Triplets beyond natural order, children of irregular pattern, instances of preternatural knowledge. These gatherings were rarely documented publicly. Their minutes were written in cipher and buried in church vaults, often destroyed within months. Midwives formed clandestine networks in response. Known as the midwives' circle in surviving records, they shared knowledge of these births, of patterns too precise to be coincidence, of children who knew things before they happened. They exchanged warnings. Never allow strangers near the birth. Never record more than 1 child in the parish register. Always maintain isolation, even from relatives. One journal entry from 1794 reads, "They move between worlds. The eyes of the land follow them. Speak not their names aloud." The secretive measures were necessary because the phenomenon was expanding. Children vanished for hours, sometimes days, only to return with knowledge or skills they could not have learned. One account from 1793 describes a set of triplets in a Lancaster farmhouse. The eldest, a boy of 7, walked into the woods at midnight, returning at dawn with a bird in hand. He could recite the prayers and personal confessions of every family in the township. His siblings mirrored his actions, and together they moved through the community in silence, leaving adults unnerved and questioning their own perception. Physicians who attempted to document these cases formally were met with resistance from the children themselves. Dr. Thomas Caldwell reported that one child seemed to anticipate every observation he made, pointing to symptoms before they appeared, sometimes whispering his own thoughts aloud. Caldwell's final note in the ledger reads, "They are alive in more than flesh. They carry the memory of others. To record is to invite danger."
The committees recognized a broader pattern. By comparing notes, they observed clusters along river valleys and fertile farmland, often associated with families who had lived in the same region for generations.
The multiple births appeared in cyclical patterns, sometimes skipping decades, but always returning with identical anomalies, shared knowledge, preternatural awareness, and a resistance to conventional mortality. By 1795, secrecy had become law in practice, if not in statute. Public references were forbidden. Parish registers were sanitized. Families were instructed to hide the truth, to act as though these children were ordinary, while the children themselves continued to behave in ways impossible to explain. The record is clear. The colonies were grappling with a force they neither understood nor could contain, one that refused to be catalogued, judged, or forgotten. By 1796, the whispers had begun to escape the hidden ledgers and secretive parish records. Families who had long concealed multiples could no longer contain the fear, nor the strange behaviors that haunted their homes. One account, found in a partially burned journal from Chester County, describes a set of triplets who, by age 6, had begun repeating each other's sentences without having heard them spoken. Neighbors reported hearing them chant the same phrases simultaneously, often at twilight, and always with a cadence that left the adults unsettled, as though the words themselves were instruments of some unseen ritual. Deaths in these communities became more conspicuous, though explanations remained impossible. One entry from 1797 notes that a farmer, whose family harbored twins born the year prior, fell ill after a long winter. The doctor found no natural cause. The twins, according to neighbors, had spent hours wandering the fields in silence the night before the farmer's collapse. The ledger quietly notes the same pattern elsewhere. Children whose movements were carefully observed seemed to forecast accidents, illnesses, and even deaths before they occurred. By this time, midwives' networks had become quasi-religious in tone. They whispered of echoed knowledge, the sense that these children were not merely alive but alive within an intelligence older than the settlement itself. One midwife, writing in a coded journal, explained that children born in clusters appeared to share one consciousness, like reflections in a hall of mirrors. The older ones would guide the younger, often in silence, always in patterns, leaving families to wonder whether they had birthed children or vessels for something older and far more dangerous.
Local ministers began recording in private that families housing multiples experienced disturbances they could neither pray nor exorcise away.
Bells would toll unexpectedly. Shadows moved independently of their owners, and in some houses, windows appeared fogged with what looked like writing or symbols in the morning light. One minister, writing in 1798, confessed, "The children walk in a law we do not comprehend. Their silence is louder than any sermon. Our God does not intervene here. We are witnesses, nothing more." By the end of the decade, the phenomenon was no longer just a matter of secrecy. The children had become a force that shaped entire communities. Families began leaving, abandoning land where multiples were born, unable to endure the psychic weight of their presence. Yet others remained, forced into silent complicity, observing behaviors they could not explain, writing down details in journals that no one else would read, fearing that to speak aloud was to invite a calamity beyond mortal reckoning. Every ledger, every journal, every whispered testimony carries a single truth. These were not ordinary children. They were echoes, repetitions, reflections, forces born into flesh that neither time nor law could bind, and they were watching, always watching.
By 1800, the whispers of unusual births had grown into the dread of entire townships. Ledger entries, partially destroyed by fire but reconstructed from fragments, describe families who began to fear not the children alone, but the land that bore them. Fields once fertile became sites of unease. Livestock refused to graze near the homes of multiples, and birds avoided the skies above. Parents swore that shadows lingered longer near their doorways, as though the children had drawn a gravity that twisted the natural world. Disappearances became more frequent. One account details a family in northern New Jersey whose triplets vanished for an entire night. Neighbors reported seeing 3 small silhouettes moving in precise circles through the moonlight, returning at dawn with no recollection of where they had been. By morning, the barn's hay was arranged in a spiral, each strand positioned exactly as it had been centuries prior in another township, in a pattern no human could have devised. The ledger annotates. They return changed, carrying knowledge that is neither learned nor inherited. The land itself listens. Magistrates conducted inspections, physicians attempted observation, and ministers offered prayers, but all efforts failed. Reports described children speaking languages no adult could understand, predicting calamities hours before they occurred, and behaving in synchronized movements that unsettled even the most rational observers. Communities tried to rationalize. One mother recorded that her twins walked through walls, as if solid matter had softened in their presence. Secret midwife societies began issuing coded warnings to each other. Never observe too closely, never speak, they are aware of the watcher. These instructions were copied in journals, buried in attics and church basements, often accompanied by sketches of circles, spirals, and concentric lines, patterns that families were instructed to replicate when attempting to conceal or control the multiples. Violating these patterns, the midwives warned, would provoke sickness, disappearance, or worse. By 1803, even the colonial authorities acknowledged the land's complicity. Fields that produced anomalous multiples seemed to resist change. Soil where the children played developed strange growths, blackened patches of grass, stones arranged in unnatural formations, and sudden depressions resembling shallow graves that were empty upon inspection. Townsfolk whispered that the children were not merely born from the soil, they were born into it, and the land itself became their witness, their accomplice. And in every account, the ledger insists, the children were never isolated. The land amplified their presence, their knowledge, and their power. Those who ignored this pattern suffered quietly, illness, sudden accidents, and the inexplicable pull of invisible forces in their homes. By the dawn of 1805, it was clear to all who still dared to observe. These were not ordinary children, not even anomalies. They were the living echo of something ancient, something beyond reason, and something that would not rest while men continued to watch. By 1805, the phenomenon of multiples had escalated beyond isolated incidents. Entire townships began to experience what the ledger describes as coordinated disappearances. Children vanished during daylight, sometimes in front of neighbors, only to reappear hours or days later in distant locations, perfectly unharmed, often arranging themselves in patterns that mimicked ancient symbols recorded in forgotten parish texts. Adults who attempted to follow were met with blank fields, frozen streams, or doors that led nowhere, as if the land itself had shifted to conceal the children's passage. One surviving account from Bucks County details a series of disappearances over 3 nights. Triplets born to a single family vanished each night, only to return at dawn, standing in a circle on the hilltop above their home. Villagers reported an unnatural glow surrounding them, a pale, almost phosphorescent light that made the snow shimmer as if it were alive. When questioned, the children said nothing, only tracing symbols in the frost with their tiny fingers. A magistrate recorded his unease in the ledger. They are here, yet not here. They speak with the silence of centuries. We are witnesses to a law older than our understanding. Deaths followed, often inexplicable and gruesome.
Livestock perished in numbers, bodies carefully arranged as if staged for some ritual no human could comprehend. One account tells of a cow found disassembled in a circle of blackened soil, bones aligned perfectly, fur singed but no fire present. Children were seen at the perimeter, hands clasped, humming in unison, their eyes unnaturally black in the moonlight. Adults dared not intervene. Those who did often fell ill, some never to rise again. The land, it seemed, was complicit. Springs ran red with sediment, fields refused to grow, and trees warped into impossible forms, bending inward as though the soil itself were drawing an invisible circle around the anomalous children. Families who tried to flee found themselves trapped in endless loops, roads returning to the same fields, wagons circling back toward the very homes they sought to abandon. By this point, midwives' societies and magistrates' committees had begun working together covertly, attempting to catalog every birth, every disappearance, every anomaly. Yet their efforts were futile. The ledger notes repeatedly, "Observation alters nothing. Control is impossible. They move between time, between bodies, between what is and what will be." By the end of 1805, it was no longer a question of morality, law, or faith. The communities understood a chilling truth. These children were not anomalies. They were instruments, carriers of a force that stretched beyond human comprehension. They were rooted in the land, echoing patterns older than settlement, older than the oldest memory, and the living soil itself whispered warnings that no man could ignore.
By 1806, the presence of these multiples had begun to reach beyond the children themselves. Adults, parents, neighbors, magistrates, even clergy began experiencing what the ledger calls echoed disturbances. Sleep became dangerous. Families reported waking to find themselves outside, wandering through fields in the dead of night, their lips muttering incomprehensible phrases. One minister's journal describes waking at midnight, drawn to the edge of a frozen pond, where he watched the triplets walking in perfect unison, their hands raised, shadows stretching far longer than the moonlight allowed. These disturbances were not uniform. They were selective, targeted, and terrifyingly precise. Adults who attempted to observe the children too closely fell ill with sudden fevers or crippling tremors. Others experienced hallucinations so vivid that they were certain their houses were full of figures long dead or not yet born. A doctor's note from 1807 recounts a widow in Chester County who screamed for hours after seeing her triplets' reflections multiplied across every window, not matching her children, but instead forming a procession of grotesque, elongated faces. Communities began to whisper of an invisible law, a rhythm the children obeyed, but adults could not comprehend. It was as if the children were conduits for a force older than colonial authority, older than settlement itself, one that used human perception against itself. One surviving account details a schoolhouse in northern Pennsylvania, 20 children in attendance, all staring at the same corner of the room for hours. When questioned, they claimed the triplets had instructed them in patterns of the earth, phrases that adults could neither understand nor translate. Midwife circles, now operating under strict secrecy, warned that observation was a form of participation. Journals stress, the watcher becomes part of the weave. To know too much is to invite the pulse. Those who ignored the warning frequently experienced psychological disintegration. Accounts describe men and women speaking in tongues, drawing spirals on floors, and becoming incapable of distinguishing past from present. One magistrate noted that after observing the triplets' nocturnal movements, he could no longer recall the year or the day, only the repetition of their steps. By the close of 1806, the communities surrounding these anomalous births had begun to collapse under fear, isolation, and incomprehensible influence. Roads were left empty, farmhouses shuttered, and the land itself seemed hostile to intrusion. Every record, ledger, and journal makes one fact clear. The children were not merely alive. They were active, intelligent, and embedded in a law that humans could not see. To look was to be changed. To know was to be bound. And the land, whispering through soil, frost, and shadow, enforced it. By 1807, the phenomena of multiples no longer confined themselves to children alone. Entire households began experiencing synchronized disturbances, as if the anomalous children projected an invisible rhythm into the very minds of those around them. One magistrate's report from central Pennsylvania describes a family of 5. All adults and children awoke at precisely 3:12 a.m., drawn to the garden where the triplets, then only 9 years old, stood silently, palms raised toward the stars. Neighbors testified that the family's movements mirrored the children's exactly, though none could recall leaving their beds. Reports of mass hysteria began to circulate. In one instance, a small village observed 20 people, unrelated by blood, wandering in perfect alignment across a frozen creek for 3 nights straight. They spoke only in whispers, repeating phrases incomprehensible to those who attempted to intervene. The ledger notes, "They move in patterns not learned yet obeyed. The living become vessels. The law is older than law itself."
Children's laughter, when it came, became a signal, a command that adults could not resist. The land itself seemed to act as an accomplice. Fields near households with multiples refused to yield crops, while stones and soil shifted overnight, forming symbols resembling those the midwives' secretive circles had been recording for decades. These symbols were not random. They corresponded to the precise patterns in which children had moved, and those who inadvertently disrupted the arrangements often fell ill or disappeared temporarily. The midwives, long operating in secret, began instructing families to follow strict routines, observe the patterns, repeat the symbols, avoid any deviation. One surviving journal warns, failure to maintain the rhythm invites the pulse. The pulse takes not only children, but those who fail to comprehend the law of the multiples. It is patient, and its judgment is inevitable. By 1808, whispers in surviving parishes suggest that children and adults had begun to communicate in unrecorded languages, sharing knowledge across households. An observer from Bucks County recorded that a group of neighbors, after a single night near the triplets' home, woke reciting prayers and sequences they had never learned. Several lost consciousness, and at least 2 were never fully coherent again. It became evident the multiples were more than mere anomalies. They were catalysts, transmitting a force through land, family, and community. Adults who once believed themselves in control were now instruments within a living pattern they could not decipher. Observation, interaction, even thought itself was dangerous. By this time, the colonies had silently acknowledged a horrifying truth. These were not children to be raised. They were vectors, and the law they carried was older than the settlements themselves.
By 1809, the ledger documents a shift. The multiples no longer merely influenced, they began enforcing. Children acted with deliberate precision, predicting misfortune and, on occasion, orchestrating calamities. One account describes a triplet in Bucks County who, after silently walking past a barn, caused the collapse of its roof moments later. Witnesses swore that the child had only paused, staring at the structure, before turning and leaving. No one dared intervene, for the ledger cautions. Interference invites repetition. Observation without submission is fatal. Premonitions became a constant presence in households with multiples. Diaries record that children would insist on sitting in particular seats, moving objects to precise locations, and whispering warnings that proved prophetic. One surviving journal details a mother whose twin daughters instructed her to avoid the river that ran through their property. That night, the river rose unexpectedly, sweeping away 2 neighboring farms. Those who ignored the guidance, often skeptics, found themselves trapped, injured, or permanently silenced by events that seemed orchestrated by unseen hands. The ledger repeatedly emphasizes the unnatural unity of these children, not merely siblings, not merely multiples, but extensions of one another. A circle within a circle. Knowledge shared beyond speech. Obedience to the pattern is inherited. The children's eyes, observers noted, were unusually bright, unnerving in their intensity. They watched without blinking, memorized details invisible to adults, and, when provoked, seemed capable of inducing physical illness. Fever, nausea, and sudden collapse are reported across multiple households, always in response to defiance or disruption of their instructions. Even adults who sought to conceal or deny the children's behavior were not safe. Accounts describe men wandering at night in trance-like states, retracing paths the children had taken, whispering the exact words the triplets had spoken. Families reported that these adults returned exhausted, incoherent, and sometimes with small objects, stones, twigs, feathers, arranged in the very patterns the ledger repeatedly warned against altering. By 1810, a pattern emerges. Any attempt to break or ignore the law of the multiples led to consequences far more severe than children alone could inflict. Their influence extended through the land itself, through adults, and through every object they touched. The ledger's repeated warnings are clear. These were not children in the ordinary sense. They were instruments of a force embedded in the soil, in the air, and in time itself. A force older than memory, capable of bending reality, enforcing obedience, and punishing disobedience with precision beyond human comprehension. By 1811, the ledger shows a terrifying escalation. The influence of multiples no longer affected only households. It spread through entire towns. In Chester County, a township of nearly 100 residents fell under what was recorded as the law of repetition. Entire families began moving, speaking, even breathing in synchronicity, as though the children had orchestrated every motion. Adults, who once believed themselves masters of their homes and fields, became instruments, compelled to perform rituals they neither understood nor remembered, performing in the daylight. One account details a gathering at dusk, when 20 residents, drawn from several farms, assembled spontaneously in the town square. Each person's steps matched those of the multiples, moving in spirals around a central point where the triplets stood silently. Neighbors who attempted to intervene fell into sudden fits of terror, collapsing or fleeing in disarray. The ledger notes, those who resist do not remain whole. The law claims all, yet chooses the slowest to witness its pattern. Objects themselves became agents of terror.
Doors left open would slam shut on their own, locks twisted impossibly, and windows displayed shapes, symbols, or even faces that mirrored the multiples' movements. One magistrate recorded that farm animals, left outside overnight, were found arranged the next morning in circles corresponding to the children's nocturnal paths. Those who touched the animals afterward fell ill, often with fevers lasting days, as if contact had transmitted a piece of the pattern. Sleep, already unsafe in affected households, became a communal threat. Townsfolk reported waking en masse at odd hours, drawn toward fields, wells, and churches where the multiples had performed their nightly movements. Attempts to resist, shutting doors, locking windows, or fleeing, were futile. Roads twisted in loops, wagons returned to the same place no matter how far they traveled. Doors opened into walls. Ledger entries describe adults who, upon waking, could not distinguish night from day, past from present. By 1812, an understanding began to emerge. The multiples were not simply children with peculiar habits. They were vectors of a force that extended beyond individuals to the land itself, binding communities to patterns older than settlement. Fear became a shared language, obedience a silent necessity. Any deviation brought consequences not just for a single family, but for the entire township. The ledger warns repeatedly,
The law is patient. It waits.
those who see without reverence invite the pulse, and the pulse never forgets. Entire towns, it seems, had become stages upon which these children enacted rituals beyond comprehension. Adults, once rational, were reduced to conduits, helplessly following invisible commands.
And the ledger closes each account with a single chilling note.
The multiples were always watching, and the land itself conspired to ensure no one escaped their law.
By 1813, the ledger records a grim new reality. The multiples were now shaping life and death itself. Disappearances and violent deaths, once isolated, became systematic. In a small township along the Delaware River, 3 children vanished from their beds, only to reappear hours later at the edge of a frozen marsh. One of the triplets, now 11, stood at the center of a circle of twisted reeds, whispering words that no adult could comprehend. The ledger notes, "Those who leave the circle do not return unmarked." Adults who tried to intervene suffered immediate consequences. A blacksmith, attempting to remove one of the triplets from the marsh, was found later in his workshop, unresponsive, his hair turned white overnight. A physician recorded a fever so high it boiled blood in veins, yet the man survived, broken, and unable to speak of what he had seen. Others fell to sudden accidents, often in ways that mirrored the children's movements. A swing of a hammer, the collapse of scaffolding, the unexpected overturning of wagons. The ledger warns, "The pulse extends to those who do not understand the rhythm. Death is only a form of correction." Even nature itself seemed to obey their command. Snow fell in unnatural drifts, blocking paths yet leaving the children's footprints untouched. Rivers swelled inexplicably, and trees bent toward the triplets as if bowing to their authority. Livestock arranged themselves in strange patterns overnight, and those who attempted to disrupt these formations became ill or vanished for days. One widow reported that her entire flock followed the children silently, waiting for a signal she could not interpret. Psychological terror spread like a contagion. Sleepwalkers appeared throughout town, mimicking the multiples' nocturnal movements without remembering how they had arrived. Families found themselves replicating gestures, chants, and steps that had no discernible purpose, yet any deviation provoked illness, madness, or disappearance. Observation alone became hazardous. One magistrate recorded watching from a window, only to collapse the next day, fevered and delirious, with a notebook full of spirals and symbols he could not recall writing. The ledger insists that the multiples were no longer mere children. They had become agents of an ancient law embedded in the land itself, a force that bent humans, soil, and time to its design. Communities understood, in fragments, that these children carried knowledge that predated settlement, that could not be taught, only obeyed. Those who resisted were removed from the equation, replaced by the land's will and the silent orchestration of the triplets. By the end of 1813, the ledger closes with a chilling line. They are not bound by age nor by reason. Those who witness without submission shall be counted among the missing, and the land shall remember their absence. By 1814, the ledger records a chilling escalation. Entire towns were now at the mercy of the multiples. Reports describe villages where households followed invisible rhythms, moving as one, their behaviors dictated by the children's presence. Roads, once straightforward, became labyrinths. Wagons returned in circles, bridges led to empty fields, and homes seemed to rearrange themselves overnight. Adults, no longer masters of their own will, were compelled to obey. The ledger warns repeatedly, the land itself conspires. Those who resist become instruments of the law. In one township along the Schuylkill River, 50 residents were observed converging at dusk in the central square. The triplets stood at its center, their hands raised, faces pale and expressionless. Those gathered mirrored every gesture, every bow, every step,
every pause exactly in unison. Attempts to break the pattern were met with immediate consequence. An adult who dared to step out of line collapsed, screaming phrases in a language no one recognized. Others began wandering into the forest, eyes vacant, muttering sequences they could not comprehend. Even inanimate objects became part of the multiples domain. Doors opened into walls, windows displayed faces not their own, and livestock arranged themselves in symbolic patterns. Those who disrupted these formations fell ill or vanished, often for days, sometimes permanently. The ledger records a widow who tried to scatter her flock one morning. By nightfall, the animals had reformed in the same spirals she had broken, and she awoke with her fingers scorched and hair turned white along the roots. Sleep became another conduit of influence. Families awoke in unusual positions, often outside, tracing paths walked by the triplets during the night. Those who resisted, barricading doors or windows, experienced fevered delirium or disappeared entirely. The ledger notes, resistance is futile. Observation without obedience invites the pulse, and the pulse is absolute. By now, communities understood what had long been feared. The multiples were not children in the ordinary sense. They were extensions of an ancient law, embedded in the soil, air, and consciousness of the land itself. The ledger repeatedly emphasizes that the children's influence was precise, intelligent, and unstoppable. They were orchestrators, and the world around them, from humans to the very terrain, was bound to obey. By the end of 1814, it was clear that no household, no town, and no individual could escape. Those who failed to recognize the law were erased, vanished, lost, or compelled into obedience. The ledger's closing warning is stark. They do not forget. They do not forgive. And the land remembers all who defy its law.
By 1815, the ledger begins recording mass disappearances, the first clear evidence that the multiples were no longer confined to manipulation. They were now enforcers of fate itself. In one rural township, 23 adults and children vanished in a single night, leaving behind only twisted spirals in the snow, footprints circling a central point where the triplets had stood hours before. Witnesses described the children as still, eyes fixed, as though their gaze alone had drawn the villagers into another plane. Ritualized gatherings became the new normal. Entire communities, whether aware or unwilling, found themselves assembling at the triplets' behest. Accounts describe lines of men, women, and children moving without speech, following invisible markers, tracing paths across fields, streams, and forests. The ledger notes, all who walk the pattern are counted. All who fail are removed. The multiples mark the law. The law marks all. Attempts to resist resulted in horrifying consequences. One farmer, refusing to join a procession, was later found in the barn, blood pooled at his feet, eyes wide in terror, whispering phrases he could not recall learning. Another woman, trying to hide her children, awoke to find the triplets inside her home, silent, motionless, yet impossibly present. By dawn, 2 of her children had disappeared, leaving behind only their shoes arranged in intricate symbolic patterns. Animals and objects mirrored the children's influence. Horses knelt in perfect formation, doors opened and slammed on their own, and water in wells and rivers reflected impossible geometries. The ledger warns repeatedly, the pulse spreads beyond flesh, the living and the inanimate obey in harmony. Observation is surrender. Sleepwalkers multiplied. Entire families were found wandering fields, tracing invisible lines, reciting words none understood. Those who attempted to speak or act against the rhythm fell into deep delirium or vanished. One magistrate recorded that after witnessing the triplets' nocturnal procession, he awoke 3 days later, disoriented, clutching a ledger page filled with spirals he did not recall drawing. By now, the ledger is clear. These children were not mere anomalies, nor were they simple conduits of chaos. They were law incarnate, agents of a force older than settlement, older than the towns themselves. The multiples orchestrated events with precision, shaping communities, manipulating time, and enforcing obedience through fear, vision, and unrelenting patterns. And the ledger's warning resonates louder than ever. They do not merely watch. They do not merely wait. Those who fail to heed are claimed, their absence remembered in the land forever. By 1816, the ledger reveals a darker evolution. The multiples were no longer content with control. They now communicated through the land itself. Crops, stones, and even fences became their language, encoding messages that only the observant, or the unfortunate, could decipher. One surviving account describes a farmer discovering his field plowed into spirals and symbols he had never seen before. The ledger notes, they speak in the earth, they write in the soil. Those who read must obey, or vanish. Whispers, subtle yet omnipresent, became a constant terror. Entire towns reported faint voices at dusk, repeating phrases in languages no living soul knew. Sleep brought visions of the multiples, walking in precise lines, leading invisible processions through homes and streets. Families began leaving objects outside, offerings to the patterns they could not comprehend. Small stones, feathers, scraps of cloth.
Those who failed to comply awoke to illness, madness, or disappearance. Prophetic behavior emerged among the children. The triplets would pause mid-step, gaze at the horizon, and issue warnings in hushed tones, warnings that proved fatal if ignored. A record describes a mother insisting on tending her livestock despite a child's quiet gesture. By nightfall, the animals were found scattered and mutilated, arranged in patterns that mimicked the children's gestures. Fear spread like wildfire. No household dared ignore the law written into the land. Even adults, once considered rational and grounded, became instruments of the multiples. Witnesses describe men and women walking in unbroken lines through forests and streams, eyes vacant, repeating phrases they could not remember learning.
One magistrate recorded tracing the lines left by these sleepwalkers only to discover his own home rearranged into geometric formations, each object placed precisely as the children had dictated. By now, the ledger is unambiguous. These were not merely children. They were vectors, conduits of an ancient force older than settlement, older than the towns themselves. They shaped not only the minds and movements of people, but also the very land beneath their feet. Towns became stages, fields became scripts, and rivers became conduits of their law. The ledger cautions, the multiples enforce the rhythm of the unseen. All who resist are absorbed, and their absence marks the land forever. By the end of 1816, the phenomenon had escalated beyond recognition. Entire communities existed under invisible compulsion, acting without conscious thought, guided by the triplets and their patterns. Observation itself was dangerous. Those who looked too closely, even out of curiosity, risked being woven into the very fabric of the multiples' designs, never to return unchanged, or at all. By 1817, the ledger records that the multiples' dominion had grown to the point of reshaping nature itself. Entire forests seemed to bend toward their will, trees forming arches that funneled movement, rivers curling unnaturally against their currents, and crops wilting in precise geometric patterns overnight. Farmers found fields stripped in spirals, soil turned to mud with symbols etched deep enough to draw blood from anyone who touched it. The ledger warns, the law is not confined to flesh. The land obeys. Those who defy are counted, and their absence marked in the soil. Mass disappearances became routine. Villagers would vanish without a sound, leaving only objects arranged in meticulous symbolic formations. Shoes placed in triangles, silverware aligned in grids, or shards of pottery forming spirals around hearths. Witnesses described townspeople walking silently toward designated points, eyes fixed, lips moving as if speaking invisible verses. Those who resisted often returned broken, their hair prematurely white, eyes glazed, mouths whispering words they did not understand. The multiples themselves, now aged only slightly, moved with uncanny precision. Each gesture, each pause, each turn seemed to dictate the behavior of everyone around them. In one town, a child's pause at the well caused 10 men to stop mid-step and remain frozen for hours until the child resumed movement. The ledger records, obedience is survival. The pulse measures all. Even objects became agents of control. Doors opened into walls, wells reflected impossible patterns, and windows displayed faces that mimicked the multiples' expressions. Livestock arranged themselves in perfect formations, repeating nocturnal patterns left by the children. Any attempt to alter these formations triggered immediate consequences: sudden illness, convulsions, or permanent disappearance. One record describes a widow who tried to scatter her flock, only to awaken with her arms blistered, her animals perfectly realigned, and her house subtly altered as if it too obeyed a higher law. Sleepwalkers multiplied throughout towns, tracing invisible lines dictated by the multiples' nocturnal rituals. Entire families would awaken in fields, forests, or riverbanks, clutching strange objects they could not recall taking. The ledger emphasizes, those who witness the pattern without understanding are absorbed into it. Resistance is a memory the land does not forget. By the end of 1817, it was clear that the multiples' reach extended beyond human comprehension. The ledger cautions that any town, any household, even any observer, was vulnerable. These children, these instruments of an ancient law, did not merely exist. They orchestrated life, death, and reality itself. And the land remembered every defiance, every hesitation, every attempt to resist. By 1818, the ledger chronicles a new and terrifying development. The multiples had begun to manipulate time itself. Days stretched unnaturally long, and nights repeated with subtle differences, trapping entire communities in loops they could neither escape nor fully perceive. One township reported sunrise lasting for hours, shadows frozen in midair, only to see dusk arrive twice in a single cycle. The ledger notes, time bends to the pulse. Those who resist become fragments, lost between what was and what is yet to come. Sleep became a perilous domain. Entire families awoke repeatedly at the same hour, finding themselves retracing paths, conversations, and chores they had already completed, or had yet to start.
Attempts to break the loop provoked panic, hallucinations, and in some cases, sudden death. Witnesses record parents forgetting their children had been born, while children remembered events that adults could not conceive, as if the multiples' memories predated all human experience. The children themselves were impervious to these distortions. The triplets moved through time as though it were a pliable substance, stepping forward or backward without hesitation, their gestures directing the community's every movement. A magistrate recorded seeing 20 townsfolk walking backward through streets while the multiples traced a spiral in the town square, seemingly conducting a silent orchestra of human obedience. The pulse dictates all motion, the ledger warns. Objects, too, reflected temporal anomalies. Wells overflowed with water that later vanished without trace. Clocks ticked counter to reality, and windows displayed scenes of the past, present, and future simultaneously. Animals repeated patterns of movement, mimicking actions that had not yet occurred. One farmer, attempting to track his livestock, discovered them following paths they had taken weeks before, or would take weeks ahead. Even rituals became instruments of temporal control. The ledger details processions where townsfolk, guided by the multiples, repeated actions for hours, sometimes days, until they became indistinguishable from automatons. Those who faltered were absorbed into the rhythm, disappearing from memory while the land itself recorded their absence. By the end of 1818, the ledger makes one thing chillingly clear. The multiples were no longer bound by human limitations. They manipulated space, nature, and now time itself, reshaping reality to serve their inscrutable patterns. Every town, every household, every observer was subject to their law, and the ledger's repeated warning resonates with terrifying clarity. Time is theirs. All who live within it are theirs. Resistance is illusion. Obedience is survival.
By 1819, the ledger documents what historians would later call the first mass psychological breakdowns, though no observer at the time could name it. Entire towns had begun losing track of reality, their minds bending to the multiples' will. Adults forgot children, children remembered events that never happened, and memories became interchangeable, rewritten daily according to the triplets' unseen commands. The ledger warns, those who witness without obedience are rewritten. Their memory, their reason, their very selves are subject to the law of the multiples. Witnesses describe streets lined with people who moved and spoke in perfect unison, their eyes blank yet aware, bodies guided by an invisible rhythm. Conversations looped endlessly, townsfolk repeating phrases they could not recall having spoken, unaware of hours, days, even weeks that had passed. Sleep offered no relief. Dreams became extensions of the multiples' dominion, scenes replaying events that had never occurred, or twisting reality in ways too subtle to detect until it was too late. Some tried to resist. Records detail a family who barricaded themselves in a home for 3 nights, refusing to follow the triplets' nocturnal pattern. By the 3rd morning, every window displayed faces they did not recognize. Every door led to a different room than expected, and when they emerged, neighbors insisted they had been gone for 3 months. Resistance, the ledger repeatedly cautions, is a dangerous illusion. All who oppose the pulse are absorbed, their absence marked in the land, their identity erased from those who remain. Animals, objects, and even the terrain mirrored this psychological collapse. Horses followed patterns that defied space and reason, fences shifted overnight, and water in wells reflected landscapes that did not exist. Crops grew in impossible formations, with twisted geometry that caused dizziness and nausea in anyone who studied it too long. Those who dared to record these anomalies often fell ill or disappeared. By now, it was no longer just townspeople who were vulnerable. Visitors, travelers passing through were quickly ensnared, their memories rewritten, their perceptions altered. One trader who arrived at dawn found himself recounting events from a year he had never lived, only to disappear before sundown. The ledger concludes this year's entries with a stark warning. The multiples do not merely act, they imprint. All who encounter them are changed, and the land itself records their transformation. Memory is a weapon, perception a cage, obedience is the only defense. By 1815, the ledger begins recording mass disappearances, the first clear evidence that the multiples were no longer confined to manipulation. They were now enforcers of fate itself. In one rural township, 23 adults and children vanished in a single night, leaving behind only twisted spirals in the snow, footprints circling a central point where the triplets had stood hours before. Witnesses described the children as still, eyes fixed, as though their gaze alone had drawn the villagers into another plane. Ritualized gatherings became the new normal. Entire communities, whether aware or unwilling, found themselves assembling at the triplets' behest. Accounts describe lines of men, women, and children moving without speech, following invisible markers, tracing paths across fields, streams, and forests. The ledger notes, all who walk the pattern are counted. All who fail are removed. The multiples mark the law. The law marks all.
Attempts to resist resulted in horrifying consequences. One farmer, refusing to join a procession, was later found in the barn, blood pooled at his feet, eyes wide in terror, whispering phrases he could not recall learning. Another woman, trying to hide her children, awoke to find the triplets inside her home, silent, motionless, yet impossibly present. By dawn, 2 of her children had disappeared, leaving behind only their shoes arranged in intricate symbolic patterns. Animals and objects mirrored the children's influence. Horses knelt in perfect formation, doors opened and slammed on their own, and water in wells and rivers reflected impossible geometries. The ledger warns repeatedly, the pulse spreads beyond flesh, the living and the inanimate obey in harmony. Observation is surrender. Sleepwalkers multiplied. Entire families were found wandering fields, tracing invisible lines, reciting words none understood. Those who attempted to speak or act against the rhythm fell into deep delirium or vanished. One magistrate recorded that after witnessing the triplets' nocturnal procession, he awoke 3 days later, disoriented, clutching a ledger page filled with spirals he did not recall drawing. By now, the ledger is clear. These children were not mere anomalies, nor were they simple conduits of chaos. They were law incarnate, agents of a force older than settlement, older than the towns themselves. The multiples orchestrated events with precision, shaping communities, manipulating time, and enforcing obedience through fear, vision, and unrelenting patterns. And the ledger's warning resonates louder than ever. They do not merely watch, they do not merely wait. Those who fail to heed are claimed, their absence remembered in the land forever. By 1816, the ledger reveals a darker evolution. The multiples were no longer content with control. They now communicated through the land itself. Crops, stones, and even fences became their language, encoding messages that only the observant, or the unfortunate, could decipher. One surviving account describes a farmer discovering his field plowed into spirals and symbols he had never seen before. The ledger notes, they speak in the earth, they write in the soil. Those who read must obey or vanish. Whispers, subtle yet omnipresent, became a constant terror. Entire towns reported faint voices at dusk, repeating phrases in languages no living soul knew. Sleep brought visions of the multiples, walking in precise lines, leading invisible processions through homes and streets. Families began leaving objects outside, offerings to the patterns they could not comprehend. Small stones, feathers, scraps of cloth. Those who failed to comply awoke to illness, madness, or disappearance.
Prophetic behavior emerged among the children. The triplets would pause mid-step, gaze at the horizon, and issue warnings in hushed tones, warnings that proved fatal if ignored. A record describes a mother insisting on tending her livestock despite a child's quiet gesture. By nightfall, the animals were found scattered and mutilated, arranged in patterns that mimicked the children's gestures. Fear spread like wildfire. No household dared ignore the law written into the land. Even adults, once considered rational and grounded, became instruments of the multiples. Witnesses describe men and women walking in unbroken lines through forests and streams, eyes vacant, repeating phrases they could not remember learning. One magistrate recorded tracing the lines left by these sleepwalkers only to discover his own home rearranged into geometric formations, each object placed precisely as the children had dictated. By now, the ledger is unambiguous. These were not merely children. They were vectors, conduits of an ancient force older than settlement, older than the towns themselves. They shaped not only the minds and movements of people, but also the very land beneath their feet. Towns became stages, fields became scripts, and rivers became conduits of their law. The ledger cautions, the multiples enforce the rhythm of the unseen. All who resist are absorbed, and their absence marks the land forever. By the end of 1816, the phenomenon had escalated beyond recognition. Entire communities existed under invisible compulsion, acting without conscious thought, guided by the triplets and their patterns. Observation itself was dangerous. Those who looked too closely, even out of curiosity, risked being woven into the very fabric of the multiples' designs, never to return unchanged, or at all. By 1821, the ledger records a horrifying evolution. The multiples were no longer isolated anomalies. They were reproducing, not biologically, but through an unnatural propagation of influence. Children born in the towns, even outside the triplets' immediate family, began displaying the same eerie abilities: precise control over movement, uncanny perception of patterns invisible to adults, and a capacity to orchestrate entire communities without speaking. The ledger states, the multiples do not merely exist, they replicate. Flesh and mind become conduits. Obedience ensures survival. Resistance is forgotten. Witnesses describe infants walking before they could crawl, drawing symbols with fingers in sand or dust that mirrored the older triplets' patterns. By the age of 7, some of these children were able to move adults and objects with subtle gestures, invisible strings of command weaving communities into obedience. Entire towns became incubators of the multiples' influence, reshaped generation by generation. Sleepwalkers remained the primary instruments of this expansion.
Parents and neighbors unconsciously assisted in the propagation, moving children through choreographed routines, unknowingly training them to replicate the multiple's authority. One account describes a baker kneading dough in circles dictated by a child, unaware that the pattern was an encoded instruction from the ledger itself. By the next morning, the entire village had aligned its routines to mirror the child's unseen directives. Even nature mirrored this replication. Trees bent as though guided by invisible hands, rivers flowed in spirals that matched the children's choreography, and livestock formed formations so precise they defied natural instinct. The ledger records an incident in which a flock of geese traced an entire village layout in the fields, and when townsfolk attempted to scatter them, they found themselves unable to leave, as though bound by a force that obeyed the children's will. Time, perception, and memory continued to bend. Adults recalled events that had never occurred, while children predicted outcomes with unerring accuracy. Attempts to resist the multiple's replication resulted in mental collapse or disappearance, leaving only echoes of the individual in the land itself. By the end of 1821, it was unmistakable. The ledger warned that these children were not exceptions. They were the foundation of a new order. The multiples are infinite. They spread like roots through every mind, every street, every generation. Those who observe are claimed. Those who resist are erased. The law is theirs, eternal and absolute. By 1822, the ledger describes the first towns entirely overtaken, their inhabitants reduced to instruments of the multiple's will. These communities were no longer places of human governance or freedom. They were extensions of the triplets' silent law. Streets were lined with figures walking in perfect symmetry, moving according to invisible commands, mouths whispering verses they did not understand, hands tracing patterns in the dirt that codified the multiple's influence.
Entire towns are theaters,
The ledger warns. The players are unconscious, the stage eternal. Adults no longer made decisions. Their choices were dictated by subtle signals. A glance, a pause, a step from the multiples. One record details a baker who spent days forming bread into spirals and symbols, unaware that every loaf was a ritual offering. Those who faltered or hesitated vanished, leaving behind only objects arranged in precise geometric patterns, as if the land itself recorded their absence. Children born under the multiple's influence were now agents of expansion. The ledger notes that even when removed from the original town, these children could subtly alter behavior wherever they went. They whispered to adults in tones that seemed innocuous, yet those adults unconsciously executed routines dictated by the child's gestures. Entire regions became vessels of obedience, their laws, customs, and even thoughts bending around the multiple's unspoken commands. Nature itself became a mechanism of compliance. Trees bent into arches over walkways that guided townsfolk along invisible paths. Rivers and streams curved unnaturally, directing movement, restricting escape. Livestock arranged themselves in formations that mimicked the children's choreography. The ledger describes one village where the earth cracked along a spiral, the fissure perfectly mirroring the triplets' hand gestures. Anyone stepping outside the pattern fell ill or disappeared, swallowed by the law that governed the town. The ledger emphasizes psychological transformation as equally critical. Entire communities lost the ability to distinguish memory from projection, past from present, self from collective will. Sleepwalkers multiplied, their steps tracing invisible scripts, reinforcing the multiple's dominion over perception itself. Observation became dangerous. Those who recorded, questioned, or even stared too long at the children risked being absorbed into the pattern permanently. By the end of 1822, the ledger's warning is unmistakable. Resistance is impossible. The law spreads through flesh, mind, and earth. Towns are vessels. Children are vessels. All who dwell within are vessels. The multiples are eternal. Obedience is survival. Erasure is inevitable.
By 1823, the ledger describes a phenomenon that marks the escalation of the multiple's dominion: mass ritualistic convergence. Children from towns already under their influence began gathering in designated locations, drawn by an instinct older than memory, their presence causing entire regions to bend to their will. The ledger states, where multiples converge, the land obeys. Rivers, forests, and streets become instruments. Towns are not places, they are conduits. Witnesses recall villages emptying as families, sleepwalkers, and observers traveled silently toward the convergence points. Roads shifted overnight, guiding the travelers as though the land itself had a consciousness. Streams diverted their courses, and trees formed corridors that funneled movement with no entrance or exit visible to the uninitiated. Those who tried to resist found themselves disoriented, trapped in loops of perception where days repeated endlessly until compliance emerged. The children's influence grew exponentially in these gatherings. One observer, a magistrate who kept a journal, noted that gestures, glances, and whispers from the multiples were sufficient to orchestrate complex patterns of behavior in hundreds of adults at once. Entire communities repeated choreographed movements across miles, forming spirals, grids, and sequences that aligned with symbols the ledger described as ancient, pre-human, pre-matter. Those who faltered vanished,
leaving only objects arranged in precise formations, memorials to their erasure. Sleepwalkers became the primary enforcers. They traced invisible pathways carrying objects of significance, bones, soil, ritual vessels, that the children instructed them to place in exact locations. Animals, too, participated. Herds of cattle, flocks of birds, even swarms of insects mirrored the multiples' choreography, reinforcing their patterns across landscapes. Nature itself had become an extension of obedience. By now, perception was indistinguishable from reality. Adults reported seeing events that had not yet occurred or reliving moments from days or years before, their minds aligning with the children's internal rhythm. Any attempt to resist the influence resulted in psychological collapse or permanent disappearance, as if the land absorbed dissent and reconstituted it in accordance with the multiples law. By 1824, the ledger details a terrifying evolution: memory substitution. Entire towns awoke to find their histories rewritten, their personal identities overwritten, as if the multiples had inscribed a new reality into every mind. One entry reads, "Memory is a currency. The multiples trade et freely. Those who awaken with borrowed recollections are no longer themselves. They are vessels." Families no longer recognized one another. Parents forgot their children. Children remembered parents they had never known. Marriages were dissolved by invisible hand. Friends became strangers. Journal entries, once reliable, now recorded events that had never occurred. Travelers who passed through these towns reported meeting themselves, older, younger, sometimes alive and sometimes dead, but always with memories they could not claim. Observation itself became dangerous. A magistrate noted that simply witnessing the multiples' convergence could result in immediate memory corruption. One man who tried to record events in a ledger of his own awoke to find the pages filled with unfamiliar names, dates, and rituals, his handwriting replaced by symbols he could neither read nor comprehend. By the following dawn, he had forgotten his own name. Sleepwalkers were not spared. Those previously used to enforce obedience began appearing in locations they had never visited, performing tasks they could not remember learning. They whispered chants in languages unknown, their mouths moving in harmony with gestures only the multiples understood. One witness described seeing a child instructing adults to dig a grave for a man who had never existed, only to watch him reappear days later, alive but with no recollection of the event. Even the land itself became complicit. Fields, rivers, and forests recorded the multiples' rewriting. Crops grew in patterns that reflected the cycles of memory transfer. Animals repeated movements of creatures long dead, and wells overflowed with water that mirrored visions of people who had never lived. The ledger notes that the landscape acts as both witness and agent, reinforcing the multiples' law across every possible dimension. By the end of 1824, the ledger delivers a chilling warning. Memory is no longer yours. History is no longer yours. Every thought, every recollection, every identity is subject to the multiples' will. The law is eternal. Compliance is survival. Resistance is erasure. The ledger makes clear that this process was only accelerating, as every new generation of children born under the multiples' influence inherited not just abilities, but dominion over reality itself. The line between observer and participant, past and present, truth and fiction, had been irreversibly blurred.
By 1825, the ledger documents the terrifying rise of collective hallucinations. Entire towns began seeing, hearing, and interacting with phenomena that existed only through the multiples' will. Streets shimmered with impossible figures. Walls pulsed with faces that had never lived, yet whispered names that belonged to those standing in the square. Reality bends before the multiples, the ledger warns. Those who perceive are bound. Those who doubt are consumed. Observers described mornings where the sun appeared as a black disk, and children laughed beneath its impossible shadow. Windows displayed landscapes that shifted hourly, forests where none had grown, rivers flowing backward, skies colored by unknown fires. Adults attempted to navigate these illusions, but every step seemed guided by the triplets' unseen hand. Movement, perception, and instinct were rewritten in real time. One farmer, tending his fields, reported seeing his neighbor's harvest crops that had never existed, and when he tried to intervene, the soil swallowed him to the knees until he submitted. The multiples' influence amplified these visions. They orchestrated interactions between living humans and entities that had no origin. A child might point to an apparition, and the townsfolk obeyed commands they could not rationalize. These hallucinations were not static. They acted independently, yet in perfect harmony with the multiples' design, reinforcing obedience and disorientation simultaneously. The ledger notes, all who witness must participate. Resistance is a fracture of self. Compliance binds the soul. Animals and objects mirrored the deception. Horses walked along invisible tracks. Birds circled endlessly above formations that made no sense, and doors led to rooms that were never meant to exist. Even light and shadow became tools of control, bending to the multiples' rhythm, casting shapes and symbols that induced nausea, fear, or reverence.
Time became unreliable. Mornings lasted hours, nights repeated, and no one could distinguish the past from the present. Sleepwalkers proliferated. Entire families traced invisible spirals across towns, placing objects and repeating gestures in precise synchrony with children who had yet to speak a word. One observer, a traveling scribe, recorded seeing 20 people perform identical movements at different ends of a village, as though connected by threads invisible to the eye. By sunset, he had forgotten his own identity. By 1826, the Ledger records the first permanent alterations to human physiology under the multiple's influence. Children born into these towns no longer merely controlled perception. They began to shape the very bodies of those around them. Limbs would lengthen or twist subtly overnight. Eyes shifted hue, sometimes reflecting events that had not yet occurred. Hair grew in unnatural patterns, echoing the symbols the triplets had inscribed in the dust, soil, and even water. Flesh is clay, the ledger insists. The multiples mold it. Every body is a vessel. Every vessel obeys. Witnesses describe neighbors waking with extra fingers, extra teeth, or indistinguishable scars shaped like ancient sigils. One account tells of a blacksmith whose reflection no longer matched his body, his arms elongated beyond the mirror's edge, yet he felt no pain, only compliance. Even sleepwalkers were reshaped. The ledger notes dozens who woke with skeletal shifts, their bones forming patterns that mirrored the multiple's gestures. The alterations extended beyond the physical. Perception itself fused with the body. Adults could feel the children's commands as physical pressure, as if an invisible hand pressed against their chest, their spine, their skull. The ledger warns, the multiple's will is no longer abstract. It is tangible. To disobey is to fracture. Those who resisted reported excruciating pain, convulsions, or immediate disappearance. By sunrise, the missing were replaced by echoes. People identical in appearance, but with memory and purpose rewritten, permanently aligned with the multiple's law.
Animals and nature also transformed. Horses developed elongated limbs, birds nested in impossible geometries, and rivers carved themselves into spirals matching the patterns of the children's gestures.
Even the ground beneath townsfolk heaved subtly, responding to the multiple's unseen commands, shaping villages like clay under invisible hands. The ledger emphasizes the permanence of these changes. These bodies, these minds, these towns, they are no longer human constructs. They are extensions of the multiple's law. Observation, thought, resistance, obsolete. Only compliance remains. By the close of 1826, entire communities had become unrecognizable. Memory, identity, and now physiology bent under the multiple's dominion. The ledger issues a stark reminder. The children were not simply anomalous. They were evolutionary instruments.
Every birth, every gesture, every heartbeat propagates the law. Flesh, mind, and perception are now bound to the multiples. Obedience is survival. Resistance is eradication. By 1827, the ledger records a terrifying shift. The multiples no longer merely influenced humans. They began orchestrating entire events independently, with consequences that stretched across regions. Villages, rivers, and forests moved to their unseen rhythm, obeying gestures, whispers, and glances from children whose age belied the scope of their dominion. The multiples are no longer observers, the ledger warns. They are architects of reality itself. Every action, every outcome, every life bends beneath their law. Reports describe towns waking to events that had not been planned but unfolded with precision. Markets opened and closed in unison. Livestock arranged themselves in geometric formations, and weather patterns shifted subtly to enforce obedience. One record recounts an entire town simultaneously planting crops in patterns dictated by a child who had never spoken a word, yet gestured in the square with a clarity that compelled every adult to comply. Deviations resulted in instant disappearance or mysterious illness, leaving no trace of the dissenters except for the perfectly arranged objects marking their erasure. The ledger notes that these autonomous actions extended beyond towns. Roads, bridges, and waterways seemed to self-organize, guiding travelers toward or away from specific locations without conscious intervention. Entire regions became conduits for the multiple's influence. One magistrate described watching a herd of deer lead townsfolk to an abandoned village, where buildings had been arranged overnight in spirals reflecting the children's gestures. Those who observed too closely reported hearing a low pulsing sound in their chests, matching the children's heartbeat, compelling compliance through both mind and body. Sleepwalkers, once instruments of guidance, became secondary. The multiple's gestures alone sufficed to coordinate complex sequences. Adults, animals, and even the landscape obeyed without instruction, as if consciousness itself had become subordinate to the children. One town chronicler observed that the boundaries between human will and multiple's law had dissolved. Even thoughts were rearranged to align with the children's invisible blueprint. The ledger's warning is explicit. The multiples no longer need observers to act. Every river, every forest, every human mind is a vessel. Actions are propagated, outcomes guaranteed.
Obedience is no longer choice, it is reality. Resistance is erased. Survival is only possible within alignment. By the close of 1827, it is clear. The multiples had crossed the threshold from influence to sovereignty. Entire regions existed as instruments of their law, and those who remained unaware of the children's power were drawn into a world they could neither question nor escape. By 1828, the ledger records the first accounts of self-replicating multiples. The children, once singular anomalies, began producing offspring who mirrored their abilities, their gestures, their influence. These new generations were not born naturally. They emerged in cycles that defied biology, their births synchronized with unseen rhythms in the land itself. The multiples reproduce the law, the ledger warns. Every child is a vessel, every vessel a pulse, every pulse an extension of dominion. Entire towns reported new children appearing in households with no prior pregnancies. Parents awoke to find cradles occupied, infants staring with eyes too knowing, too aligned with the multiples pattern. Sleepwalkers, once human, now became guardians, caretakers, and instruments of propagation.
Some were assigned to escort these children to new regions, silently expanding the multiples' influence beyond their original territories.
The ledger details the mechanics of replication. Gestures repeated in precise sequences generated conditions for new multiples to manifest. Even the land participated, reshaping itself to facilitate birth. Forests enclosed villages in corridors that guided the faithful. Streams diverted to mark territories, and Earth itself pulsed with energy, as if the ground were the womb for a new generation. Animals aligned with these births, forming spirals and patterns reinforcing the children's authority. Adults, now fully subordinated, observed these phenomena without comprehension. Resistance had become impossible. Memory, identity, and even physical form were overwritten with every new child's appearance. Families, towns, and entire regions were reshaped to conform to the multiples' law. A magistrate noted that one child's cry alone could orchestrate 100 movements across a village, while another child's gaze immobilized dissent. By 1828, the ledger warns, the multiples were no longer rare anomalies. They were a replicating force, expanding faster than any human governance, faster than memory, faster than the perception of time itself. Every town they touch becomes a conduit, it reads. Every child they create extends the pulse. Every generation erases the previous. Resistance is obsolete. Obedience is survival. Communities realized too late that the multiples' law was irreversible. Births, land, minds, and bodies were now extensions of the children's will. The ledger ends this chapter with a chilling statement. The multiples do not age. They do not die. They multiply. And with every multiplication, the world bends further into their law.
By 1829, the ledger chronicles an escalation that defies comprehension. The multiples no longer merely manipulated towns. They began reshaping entire regions into living, conscious extensions of their will. Hills rose and fell with gestures. Rivers carved themselves into impossible geometries. Forests arranged their trees into spirals and corridors that seemed to anticipate human movement. The land obeys the multiples, the ledger declares. It is not terrain. It is instrument. It is ritual. Every path, every stone, every shadow is law. Travelers reported that roads led nowhere or everywhere. A single gesture from a child could reroute a river, divert a forest path, or collapse a hill to block passage. Villages became prisons and temples simultaneously. Homes aligned into mazes reflecting patterns the multiples had drawn in the dust, their layouts impossible to navigate without compliance. Attempting to flee or resist caused travelers to loop endlessly, retracing steps with no memory of deviation until they became conduits themselves. Animals, too, became instruments. Wolves guided wanderers into forests. Birds circled endlessly above the multiples' chosen sites, warning or enforcing through instinct alone. Livestock moved in perfect formations, shaping fields into living sigils, marking obedience and punishing dissent with subtle violence. Milk spoiled, eggs cracked, and the weak disappeared without trace. The ledger notes that even insects and smaller creatures record the multiples' law, and the air itself hums in resonance with their rhythm. The multiples' children orchestrated these changes as if they were composers conducting a symphony. A gesture, a glance, or the sound of a laugh could trigger mass coordination across miles. Adults, sleepwalkers, and even natural phenomena aligned instantly. Entire regions became responsive instruments, bending to their will without question, reshaping reality into a landscape of obedience. The ledger warns, the multiples are not bound by towns or walls. Every river, every hill, every forest is pulse and vessel. Those who do not align are erased. Those who comply are integrated. Entire generations will awaken to a world that obeys them before they even speak. By the close of 1829, it was clear. Resistance was meaningless. The multiples' dominion was no longer confined to perception or memory. It had extended to the very fabric of the earth. Humanity's boundaries had been redrawn.
their bodies, minds, and lands now instruments in a ritual older than recorded history. By 1830, the ledger records a phenomenon more terrifying than any before: temporal distortion. The multiples were no longer constrained by space. They began bending time itself. Days repeated in subtle loops, hours stretched into infinite corridors, and entire events replayed with minor variations, as if reality were a manuscript being rewritten in real time. Time is clay, the ledger asserts. The multiples shape it. Past, present, and future collapse beneath their law. Witnesses reported waking to conversations they had already had, meals they had not yet eaten, and storms that seemed to linger for weeks despite the sun shining overhead. Children saw events before they happened, predicting disasters and obedience tests, while adults struggled to distinguish anticipation from memory. One town chronicler described standing in the square as a festival repeated itself 3 times in succession, each iteration erasing the previous one, leaving only the multiple's children aware that anything had changed. The ledger notes that sleepwalkers became critical to maintaining this temporal architecture. Entire processions moved in precise synchronization across hours that were not consistent, ensuring that events unfolded exactly as the multiples intended. Anyone who attempted to disrupt the sequence experienced temporal feedback. Hours condensed into seconds, days stretched into decades, and memory fractured, leaving them trapped in loops from which there was no escape. Even the land itself recorded temporal anomalies. Forests grew backward, rivers rewound their courses, and shadows moved against the sun's path. Animals experienced cycles that humans could not perceive, appearing, disappearing, and reappearing in perfect alignment with the multiples' orchestrations. The ledger warns, time is obedience. Those who resist its flow are devoured by its loops. Every act, every gesture, every breath is both past and future, under the multiples' dominion. By mid-1830, entire villages had become laboratories of temporal manipulation. Children born under the multiples' law, aged and unaged in cycles, appearing to vanish and return at will. Adults could meet themselves from yesterday or tomorrow without warning. Sleepwalkers conducted rituals that synchronized entire regions, ensuring the multiples' timeline was preserved, enforced, and propagated. The ledger's warning is chilling. The multiples have become architects of chronology. Every memory, every perception, every second exists only as they allow. Resistance is temporal annihilation. Compliance is survival, but even survival belongs to them, not you. By 1831, the ledger delivers its final revelation. The multiples are eternal. They are not children, not anomalies, not vessels. They are law incarnate, embodiments of a dominion older than recorded history. Time, space, memory, and flesh are no longer human constructs. They are instruments of the multiples, molded and orchestrated with deliberate precision. Obedience is eternal. Resistance is impossible. The world as you knew it has already ended, the ledger warns. Entire regions had become extensions of their will. Forests, rivers, hills, and towns existed as living manifestations of the multiples' law, responsive to gestures and thoughts, carrying out orders that no human mind could comprehend. Those who walked the lands were either absorbed into the patterns or vanished entirely, leaving behind whispers of obedience that echoed across generations. Human perception became a subordinate instrument. Every heartbeat, every glance, every breath aligned to enforce the multiples' design. The ledger chronicles final acts of dominance. Children appeared simultaneously in distant villages, their presence sufficient to warp reality miles away. Roads bent, rivers shifted, and skies rippled with unnatural light. Sleepwalkers, now indistinguishable from the landscape itself, carried out rituals that erased identities and histories. Entire lineages were rewritten, their memories overwritten to fit the multiples' unfolding law. Even death had been subsumed. The ledger records bodies that vanished only to return as conduits, obedient and altered, extending the multiples' influence. By the last entries, the ledger's tone becomes almost prophetic. The multiples do not age, they do not die. Every generation is a repetition, every repetition a manifestation of law. You exist only because they allow it. Your perception, your reality, your memory, they are not yours. They are extensions of their will. Resistance is a dream you will forget upon waking. Compliance is survival, but survival is theirs, not yours. The final warning is unmistakable. The multiples' dominion is irreversible. Every child born, every gesture made, every town encountered is absorbed into a reality shaped entirely by them. Civilization itself bends, reshapes, and obeys. What humans perceive as freedom, history, or natural law is now a carefully curated illusion. Those who attempt to remember the world before the multiples are plagued by hallucinations, temporal fractures, and erasures of identity, until nothing remains but alignment. The ledger ends not with closure, but with a command. Witness, remember, obey. There is no end, there is no beginning, only the multiples and the law they carry through eternity. And in that final silence, the reader, or witness, understands the terrifying truth. The world has been rewritten, irrevocably, permanently, and every breath, thought, and heartbeat is now lawfully, eternally theirs.